So hello, welcome to another Paro seminar. What I want to do today is kind of like, I suppose, give an argument that is central to the book that I'm currently writing. So I've got back to writing. I'm hoping to have the first draft finished by Christmas, but I've got a strong feeling that I'm going to do a rewrite after Christmas, so it's not going to be finished at Christmas, but the first draft should be done by Christmas. Then it might take another few months to rework it, then it'll be done, and then I'll decide what to do with it. But I'm working on a chapter at the moment that is touching on, I suppose, a critique of kind of modern atheism, evolutionary psychology, and a few other things. So I thought I would kind of outline a little bit of what I'm doing in that chapter. I might not get through everything I want to get through today, so this might become a two-parter. I want to take my time with some of these ideas. So where will we start? I want to start with the idea of affirmation and negation. So to affirm something is to, say God exists or whatever. To negate something is to say God doesn't exist. So this affirmation and negation, or you can say something works and something doesn't work. And in our everyday speech, this is, how we talk. Something has a quality or does not have a quality. So for example, we might say that, the prosperity message or the secret, that idea, you go like, oh, it works, right? Prosperity gospel works if you pray a certain way, or if you manifest certain things, you will be more likely to get them, right? So you say it works. And then the alternative is you say, well, no, it doesn't work, right? Here's some statistics to show that, the secret or whatever doesn't seem to have any kind of real material difference, right? So that's work or it doesn't work. You might do the same with, say, relationships. Well, this relationship works or it doesn't work. In capitalism, right? If you're kind of defending capitalism, you would say, well, capitalism, broadly speaking, works. And it works because it kind of coheres with human nature. It kind of like our desire to maximize utility, to minimize our suffering, to kind of like to want more and better, right? So there's something like capitalism that to some extent mimics our utilitarian desires, our rational desires. And then, someone might say, of course, and there are elements that don't quite work, right? There's problems that will hopefully be solved through technology, through maybe fair trade, through universal income or whatever, right? But broadly speaking, it works. And then there are those who say, well, no, it doesn't work. Capitalism breeds inefficiencies, alienation, inequalities, repressions and depressions, right? So it doesn't work. And so the argument back and forth, it works or it doesn't work. And even something like gambling. Somebody might say, well, I gamble on the horses because I can crack it. I can work, I can make money through this. And then somebody else might say, well, no, you can't. It's not going to work. It's not going to, it's good. There's a problem here, right? So on a very basic level, that's the way a lot of us think. But there is this notion of the negation of negation, right? So there's the affirmation of something, there's the negation of something, and then there is the negation of negation. And this third position is quite hard to get your head around initially, but I'm going to give lots of examples, but has a really interesting insight. So the negation of negation is, right, something works, something doesn't work. Something works because it doesn't work, right? So taking all the examples I took before, what was my first one? Oh yeah, the prosperity gospel, right? If you merely take affirmation and negation, what you find is that people will think that education is the way to overcome the problem, right? Go like, okay, people are caught up in the prosperity gospel. If I can show them that it doesn't work, if I can demonstrate through statistics, through kind of sociological studies, et cetera, that it doesn't work, then I will free them from it. So education is central, right? But with the negation of negation, the idea is, no, the prosperity gospel works precisely because it doesn't work, right? There is something about it not working that generates a fantasy of like what would happen if it did work, right? And that fantasy entraps us. We are kind of caught in this fantasy that's precisely generated by the failure of the prosperity gospel or the failure of the secret. Hence, education won't work, because it hooks into something in us that wants it not to work. Like, that's its precise power. Relationships, again, it's not just a relationship works or it doesn't. We can be caught up in relationships that work because they don't work. That precisely because of a problem and a failure and an obstacle keeps us entwined within it. And no amount of education or good advice is ever going to work, because again, there is some dimension of us that is enjoying the suffering, right? Some element of us, unconscious element, that is getting something out of the damage and the destruction. Same with gambling. It's maybe the gambler isn't addicted to the winning, but they're actually addicted to the losing. It's the losing that generates jouissance, right? Freud noticed this in the Fort Dagian, when he noticed that his nephew, this infant, was throwing a spool of cotton away and then pulling it back. And he noticed that the infant was getting lots of joy from throwing it away, from getting rid of it, for presence and absence. But there was a kind of a joy in loss, right? There was a joy also in the bringing it back, but the getting rid of it. There's something about the loss that is pleasurable, right? And then capitalism, you could say that, and this is the argument of someone like Todd McGowan, is that capitalism works precisely because it doesn't. Again, it's like there's something about sacrifice, inefficiency, struggle, suffering that we enjoy, that we get something out of, that somehow hooks us in. So if capitalism was successful, it would actually not work. And the idea is that, if I take the capitalist argument there, is in the affirmation, a person, and someone like Ayn Rand or Adam Smith or Ricardo, would say basically capitalism still has problems. They're contingent problems that can be overcome, and if you overcome those problems, the more you overcome those problems, the more capitalism can free itself, can fly. So Ayn Rand is a very good example of that, where in her work there's often these impediments to capitalism's free flowing, and what needs to happen is you get rid of these contingent obstacles for capitalism to fully flourish. And then the argument against it is that, well, no, it's kind of similar. It's like, there are problems in capitalism, but actually there's a better way of doing it. There's a better system that we can create that will better solve the problems that we see in capitalism. But in both of those, the obstacles are contingent. They can be overcome. They can be gotten rid of. In the negation of negation, the idea is that no, the obstacles aren't contingent, they're necessary. They're the actual thing that allows the system to actually flow. The failure is inherently its success. And that's a kind of a positivizing of the negative, right? Now, the negation of negation, the problem is that we don't see this. We don't acknowledge it, right? This, I think, is the problem with a lot of kind of modern discourse in terms of modern atheism, evolutionary psychology, modern kind of ethical theories like utilitarianism. They all work on the idea that pretty much that we want our own best interests. We want to maximize our pleasure. We want to minimize our pain. We're moving forward to try to increasingly overcome contingent obstacles. And we may be fantasizing a time when, through AI and through technology and et cetera, production, we can have a life without sacrifice, without struggle, like a life without obstacle of any kind of significant type. But the Freudian death drive is the negation of negation, and the idea that no, there is a part of us that enjoys this negative dimension. And when we don't acknowledge it, it's destructive. It wreaks havoc. And the answer is not to try to see it as contingent and try to overcome it, but rather to see it as necessary, to acknowledge it, to symbolize it, right? To kind of speak it. So to understand this, you could take, and I'm taking a little bit of this from Zizek's latest book, Surplus Enjoyment, where you could say, right, there are different ways in which knowledge and being, knowledge and existence work, right? So a simple materialist reading of reality is there is stuff out there that exists whether or not we know about it, right? Our knowledge is indifferent to the reality that is out there beyond us. Then you've got a type of subjective idealism, someone like Berkeley, who would say that everything exists only because we know it. Everything only exists because of our knowledge of it, or of God's knowledge of it. So pure idealism, the reality is held up through the idea. And then you could say that there's the mystical kind of religious notion that there is something that exists that we cannot know, right? There's an existence that transcends our knowledge, that we cannot grasp conceptually. But then there's this fourth one, which is very interesting, which is things that exist only because we don't know them, right? They exist purely because of our lack of knowledge. And once we come to know them, they cease to exist. And that at first is the most weird type of phenomenon. But that is the phenomenon of the symptom, right? The symptom is what exists because you don't know what it means, right? You don't know it. And technically, as you come to know the symptom, come to hear it speak, come to understand it, it dissipates. So if, which it could be, if my sore neck was a symptom, not just I pulled a muscle, but something that had symbolic significance, it would continue to persevere and exist until I came to know why it was there. And in the knowledge of it, the symptom would change. So give me an example of this. Two examples. One is a friend of mine, I think I've used this once before, but it was a couple of years ago. He was talking about how his wife was always putting him in the doghouse, always seeing him as wrong. He was always having to apologize to her. He always felt that he was not living up to what she wanted. And sometimes he didn't, like sometimes he was a bit of an idiot, you know, but he said like, felt like it's all the time. And this was a difficult issue within their marriage. But as we talked, it became obvious that his wife, her desire is evoked by being wooed. And it became obvious that his desire is evoked by wooing, by winning over. And what's happening in without knowing or acknowledging their desire, what was happening was this very unhealthy thing where she seemed to always be annoyed at him. He was always having to apologize. The relationship was on the verge of collapse. But when he realized that, hold on a second, I like to win her over and she likes to be won over, then he, just purely through the knowledge of that, the symptom of the kind of the destructive elements of the desire began to lift immediately, like it began to dissipate. He immediately felt a changed experience in relation to her. He started to see her immediately in a different way. So the symptom kind of ceased to exist purely in coming to know it. So that's just kind of one example. Oh, another one, which is a personal example, was I did in psychoanalysis years ago. I was in an unhealthy kind of relationship, or was coming out of it. And I said to the analyst, you know, I guess I'm just addicted to the highs, right? The highs of the relationship, the moments that are amazing. And the analyst said, or the lows, right? And at that moment, I kind of had this insight that yes, I was addicted like the gambler, not to the highs of the relationship, but in some way I was addicted to the lows. I was addicted to the dimension of suffering that was within it. And in that moment of kind of realizing that, my relationship to that shifted, right? In the knowledge, the symptom kind of dissipated. So that's example of the negation of negation. And the issue is, in the affirmation and the negation, right, there is this inability to acknowledge this this third space, this kind of like this positivizing of the negation, right? That's not seen. So the reason why I threw things like evolutionary psychology under the bus a little bit, and maybe things are changed a little bit, but evolutionary psychology is based primarily on the evolutionary idea that we can't, just like a broken arm will naturally want to heal if you kind of treat it well, so subjectivity, we naturally want to be rational, we naturally want to maximize utility, we maximize our pleasure, minimize our displeasure, right? That's kind of, and so any behavior that you see that goes against that is just a contingent enigma, it's a contingent issue. It's some sort of like little hiccup in kind of evolution. It's so for example, if you eat poison berries, it's not because you want to eat poison berries, it's because those berries look like ones that you could eat, as an example, right? But anything that you do is in some way explainable in terms of utilitarianism, and any behavior that's kind of weird or wrong, say it's a contingent problem that can be done away with. The Freudian insight is no, there's a necessity, there's something about us that actively embraces this negation of negation, this negativity, that positivizes this negativity. The name of this is the unconscious, right? The unconscious, and for Freud, isn't a thing. It's not like early on he had the kind of image of an iceberg, and there's a little bit of consciousness, and then under the sea there's this vast unconscious. But as he developed his work, he rejected this notion, right, which you still see in Jung or whatever. It's go like, no, the unconscious isn't some substantive thing beneath consciousness. The unconscious is within consciousness, an element that is that prevents us from being at one with ourselves. So the unconscious is a type of negation of negation. It's a kind of naming of a negative, of a nothing. Even zero is a type of naming of nothing, right? So, and that was a big advancement for mathematics, whenever you're actually able to name nothing by putting a circle and kind of naming the nothing and make it, signifying it, right? So how does this all connect then with theology and with paratheology? Well, kind of standard theism says God exists, and standard atheism says God does not exist. But in this level, you can say, well, no, God is the non-existent thing, right? So instead of this argument, God exists or God doesn't exist, back and forth, which you see eternally going on, and all of the arguments being rejigged in various minor ways and kept alive, right? The most interesting theological responses to that debate have always been, no, God is not something that exists or does not exist. God is a signifier of a dimension of reality that we cannot objectify, that we cannot name, that defies existence in some way. You see this in Paul Tillich, you can see it in Karl Barth, you see it in various mystics like Meister Eckhart. That God is literally the signifier of an unnameable reality. And you have this obviously in the biblical text. You have the tetragrammaton, which is a signifier that you can't even say, that kind of signifies something beyond signification. The fact that you've got so many names of God that clash and contradict each other, again in the biblical tradition, is the way of saying that none of these names grasp what they're attempting to grasp. So then theology becomes really the first discipline and the potentially primary discipline for a language that keeps open this negation of negation, that allows you to signify it, to become aware of it, to orient yourself towards it, right? To orient yourself towards doubt, unknowing, complexity, mystery, to not close it down, which can happen so easily in various discourses. And in a way, the argument is that God is, if this negation is operating everywhere, it's operating in relationships, it's operating in the political domain with democracy, the non-at-oneness of the political body, it creates democracy. It's happening in mathematics. I've mentioned Gödel's uncertainty principle or incompleteness theorem various times. In physics, quantum indeterminacy, right? If this domain of the negation of negation is at work in various domains, the name God can be the name of the negation as such that covers everything, right? So God becomes a signifier of the lack within everything, of a dimension that cannot be named or articulated, not contingently, but necessarily, right? So a humanist argument about religion is that religion arises from us being shock and awe at the natural world, right? Or at existential questions, or the most sci-fi one of all is some alien civilization came to Earth and we saw this technology and we didn't understand it, we were in awe of it, and kind of religion is birthed from that, right? This famous book, Chariot of the Gods, from like the 1960s, I think, argued that. But it's kind of like a funny version of what a lot of humanist arguments are, which is religion simply arises from our experience with something that we contingently can't understand. Now, we could understand hypothetically, but we just don't understand. So in other words, religion is a type of cargo cult. If you've heard of cargo cults, in the Malaysian islands during the Second World War, these cults, or these little religious groups, kind of arose that a lot of them were kind of focused on a savior who looked like an American GI, right, American soldier, and believed that this American soldier would come back and would rid the islands of foreigners and would bring lots of cargo, lots of products, right? And these religions partly grew out of the fact that these islanders had no contact with civilization, and then during the Second World War these islands were used by the military, and these cargoes were left there, like military equipment, canned goods, clothes, all the stuff that these islanders had never seen before. And so this got brought into the kind of the religions, and so to this day we have these cargo cults. So there's a certain sense in which all religions are a type of cargo cult that arise out of either, as I say, maybe alien civilizations, the most extreme weird one, to just, wow, we don't know how crops feel, we don't know why earthquakes happen, we're confounded by this universe and this world, and so we kind of start to create mythological answers to those questions. But the theological answer to that is to redouble it and to say, well, no, religion doesn't arise from an experience of contingent surprise. It arises from a type of encounter with the real that can never be explained, a type of reality that is beyond signification, that cannot be grasped at all. Now, there's a few different ways that you can parse that out, right? So you've got, and I did a seminar on this about 6 months ago, you can look at, and I want to recover some of this territory maybe next month, but you've got like the mystical work of someone like Jean-Luc Marion, who says that God is so hyper-abundant that we cannot grasp God. You've got the work of someone like John Caputo, who talks about God as this promise and openness to the future. So you can never grasp God, because in a way God is hope. God is the hope for a better world. God is a hope for a greater democracy and greater justice that is always open to the future. Or you've got this more psychoanalytic reading, which is God is the name for an absolute, a contradiction at the heart of reality, a void at the heart of reality. But all of these, in different ways, are all saying that theology is a type of negation, right? That it's interesting, Shizeka as well, he mentioned one time that Christopher Hitchens named the book God is Not Great. And Shizek did his typical clever little response and said, well, what a great name for a Christian book, because that is the idea. Christ is the revelation that God is not great, right? That God dies, that God is weak. But that weakness, that obstacle, is the strength, right? That weakness is it. So that's why John Caputo's theology is called weakness, the weakness theology, weakness of God, is there's something about the negation, the failure, that is actually the success, right? And so something like paratheology, and what we're trying to do here is create communities in which we remain, where we signify this lack, because that's key, right? In the examples I used, the problem is that if we do not have a way of signifying that lack, of naming it, of orienting ourselves to it, of creating a way of inviting it and welcoming that within ourselves, if we push it out, if we push it onto other people, that's where the damage is, right? Negation is not the problem, it's the failure to signify it, the failure to express it. But if you have a space in which you embrace things like doubt, unknowing, complexity, mystery, then what you're doing, I think, is creating a healthier type of community, a community healthier both individually and something that can be healthier politically as well for society. And I kind of am tempted to say that type of space welcomes anyone who has a type of understanding of their lack of understanding, right? The one thing you can be certain of is uncertainty. So it's not uncertainty, it's certainty. It's certainty about uncertainty. It's kind of like it's a knowledge of a type of ignorance. And I say there's ways in which it can be parsed out. So there's the kind of hyper-theistic way, which is God is a superabundant reality that only ever appears as a lack or a paradox to us because we are saturated, we cannot grasp it. Or you have the Caputian notion of God as the name for an openness to the future, an openness to events, a promise, right? Faith is this promise. Or you have the notion that God is the name for this contradiction at the heart of everything. Faith is about embracing the contradiction. So I guess in what you could say at this level is faith is embracing the paradox that results from the hyperabundant God. The second one is faith is the embrace of hope, in the face of hopelessness. And in this third position, faith is the embrace of contradiction. And all of them, although my favorite one is probably the contradiction one, I think, and there's reasons why I think that. I also go, all of these are superior to the current modern theistic and modern atheistic debates, right? Because the modern theistic debates in the confessional church generally, especially within, say, evangelicalism, is God exists. Modern atheism is God does not exist. But it doesn't go the next step to God is the signifier of non-existence as such, of something that cannot be grasped. Okay, with that, I'm going to see if you've got any questions or comments. So I'm just going to have a little look. Oh yeah, I didn't say actually. So you've lots of people saying hello and all of that. If you've got any questions, fire ahead, stick them down, and I will have a look at them. I'll say one more thing then about it while you're writing down some questions. The reason why I think this is connected particularly with Christianity is it's very much this notion of Christ as the obstacle to God that is God, right? That's the kind of idea of the crucifixion, is to get rid of God, and then the obstacle to God, what do they call the stone that the builders rejected, is the capstone, right? The very failure is the success, right? The very failure to get to God is God. And that's what you see in the Apostle Paul when he's persecuting this group of Christians. He thinks they're the obstacle to the true religion, and then he hears a voice, why are you persecuting me? And he realizes that the obstacle is the truth. The obstacle is the path. And again, the problem is that the negation of negation is always operating. It's always there. There is a dimension of us called death drive where we want our sacrifice, our struggle. There's a certain part of us that often revels in our own pain. But when we don't acknowledge it and when we don't see it, that's when it becomes destructive, fundamentally destructive. But when you're able to signify it, when you're able to acknowledge that part of yourself, paradoxically, that is the moment when the yoke of it lifts. So I'll do the argument of capitalism, and I say, fire down any questions. Is if you take this argument, right, capitalism works, capitalism doesn't work, or capitalism works because it doesn't work, then what is the solution? The solution here is that if capitalism was able to acknowledge that, if like basically enough people within this system were able to acknowledge that somehow we enjoy our suffering, our struggle, there's our pain, our difficulties, because sacrifice is what generates meaning, right? You can't have meaning without sacrifice, right? The more you sacrifice, the more meaning you get, right? But there's this unhealthy, repressed sacrifice. We have the fantasy of sacrifice, the fantasy of winning the lottery and retiring and not having to work ever again. I'm susceptible to it. On Instagram, I follow some of these house Instagram ones, and one of the ones that they show you mega rich houses, right? Houses that are worth like 100 million, and it is really interesting to look at, you know. But of course, there's a little element of me that's like, oh, you know, what an amazing place. But I saw one today, and it had this massive cinema screen outside and in the pool, so you could sit in the pool and watch your TV and all of that. And I couldn't help but think, which is really good actually, I was like, how boring would that be? Because I had the big Netflix thing, and I'm going like, I can't find anything good to watch on Netflix when I'm lying on my bed with my small TV. Like, I don't think it's going to be any easier to find something good to watch on Netflix if it's a massive screen and I'm standing in the pool, you know. But I'm going like, oh yeah, it would be boring. Like, that life would be, if I just got that life, how boring would it be? Like, what excites me is this, what we're doing right now, trying to figure out kind of how to think well about our lives, our situations, and how to institutionalize those ideas, how to get them out in the world, and how to see that knowledge and change are interconnected. All of this is exciting, right? Living in $100 million house would be really fun for a bit. And then I think I'd just be profoundly bored, and I guarantee you that I would be in one room on one sofa for the majority of it, you know? Like, it's kind of like apartment life is, the more rooms you have, just more rooms you don't go into. Anyway, but there's the fantasy of getting rid of the sacrifice, the fantasy that we can overcome all of that is if we ever got that, it would be depressing. If we ever got it, our lives would become vacuous. Because we need sacrifice, we need struggle, we need inefficiency, right? In Instagram, all these people who are telling you how to be efficient, how to life hack, how to maximize every minute so that you can be more productive and achieve your goals. You know, that's all very well, but also we need to be ineffective sometimes, and we need to be rubbish with our times and sacrifice our times on silly things, right? And that even makes the other stuff more valuable. But the point is, we don't see it. This is all kind of how it works and how it operates. But until we gain that insight, until we feel it in our bodies, we remain trapped in these frenetic pursuits. So hypothetically, not changing the capitalist system at all, but simply acknowledging how we're hooked in by its failures is how you transform it, right? That's the kind of example I used of a knowledge of something that exists only because you do not know it, right? There's things that are indifferent to your knowledge. There's an idea that everything only exists because of your knowledge. But this is a thing that potentially only exists because we do not know. Because we do not know how we are inscribed into it. And so the knowledge itself is what frees you. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free, right? So that's a really interesting phrase, and I come back to it a lot because I think it's very insightful, because obviously it's not like you shall know 2 + 2 = 4 and that will set you free or whatever, right? There's something about it that you shall, if you know the truth of the symptom, then you're free, you become freed from it, right? There's something of, we are trapped within economic and cultural and religious systems precisely because of a lack of knowledge, a lack of insight. And somehow, once you have that realization, you find a freedom. And so you don't have to change anything, right? Grace, you don't have to do anything. Self-help is always trying to get you from A to B. You don't have to get from A to B. You don't have to do anything. You just sit and acknowledge, accept the situation, see it and accept it. But in the seeing and the accepting, the transformation takes place, right? So it's weird paradox of you stop, you accept, you see, and in that a transformation occurs. And yeah, I've got lots of more things to say, but right, over to questions. Brilliant. I'm going to answer the first question first, which is, are you still doing the Fundamentalist podcast with Elia? We've been really slack. So I know we were probably asking, am I going to do it when I'm in Belfast? We haven't even been doing it here, but we did talk about it. We did a podcast last week. I don't know if it's out yet. It might be out. But we did say to ourselves, we're going to try and schedule a regular thing and regularly do it. So yes, I can't promise it because I know how bad we are, but we're both trying to be committed to doing that regularly. And I even think we might do it more regularly now that I'm away, right? Because usually when he comes around, we just have a few drinks and hang out. But if we actually put it in our calendar and go, we do it on this day at this time, perhaps we'll actually be more, better at it. Ben says, are you saying we are all existentially incompliant? I would like you to unpack that more. Unfortunately, in chats you can't say very much, so I might be asking you the impossible. But if you want to, because I think I'm kind of saying, yeah, we're existentially act against our own self-interest at times. Like this is the unconscious. Like consciously, that's why we don't see it, because consciously we do want to maximize our pleasure, minimize our pain. Consciously we want to engage in the world and get through life, but the unconscious is this dimension that subverts that, which is brilliant, by the way. Once it can damage us, but it's also where freedom and change happen. It's what makes us incompliant. If to use that term, actually, is that the unconscious is what stops us from being fully immersed in our world. That kind of makes us out of step with our world, in the world, but not of it. But yeah, I would love to hear more about what you think, because I think I'm tracking with you, but I just want to make sure. Oh yeah, Alison says, people seem to, I'm going to move this closer so I don't keep disappearing. People seem to stop listening once we say we can't know for sure. Forecasting is more popular than uncertainty. Yeah, and the funny thing is, when I started this work, it started primarily as an exploration of unknowing, mystery, and the kind of how that operates. And then, but very quickly, as a philosopher and as someone who is kind of influenced by the work of people in psychoanalysis, I kind of want to, and not say that there's an unknowing, like, hey, we don't know. I want to kind of say that, of course, there's stuff we don't know. Like, there's loads of things. I love watching stuff on YouTube on things I don't know. Like, it could be some random thing. Like, recently I've been watching stuff on IT and algorithms and stuff like that. And it's not a world I know anything about. So there's lots of things we don't know. And then there's stuff that we know. What's really interesting to me is a realm of unknowing that is inherent to reality. So you can know it. You can know the unknowing. It's because I understand it. Like, it can sound lazy. It sounds lazy to me. Sometimes I talk to some of my friends who are religious leaders who have got into this idea of we don't know and we can't know. But, they don't really sit down and think or read very much. So the unknowing really comes across as, an unknowing of, a lack of reading or something. Whereas someone like Thomas Aquinas, he wrote his Summa, this massive piece, and at the end says, what I experienced in Mass, he had this experience, makes all of this but straw, I shall write no more. But he experiences like a learned unknowing. And so what's interesting to me is we can move often from certainty to uncertainty, and then there's this other step, again, the negation of negation, which is a certain uncertainty, that there is a dimension of unknowability within the world. And in physics is a great example of this, where at the quantum level, we work with probabilities. And it's not because we lack knowledge, it's actually because we have such precise measurements that we end up in this world of probability. It's not a probability that comes from a failure. It's a probability that's kind of hard baked into reality itself. Like my favorite quote, my favorite joke of any comedian, I think is brilliant, is that guy Mitch Hedberg or something like that. Kind of, I always forget his surname, but he talks about Bigfoot and says, you know, all these pictures of Bigfoot are blurry. And he says, but you know, what scares me is, like, he says, maybe Bigfoot is just blurry, right? So in other words, like, instead of like, oh, you can't get him a crisp image because, you know, he's always moving or whatever, it's like, well, what if Bigfoot is blurry? And the reason why I like that joke is because I think it's a great expression of like quantum mechanics, which is like, we seem to always get a blurry image of reality at a quantum level. And then the insight of people like Niels Bohr was, well, maybe reality is fuzzy, right? That there's a fuzziness, an uncertainty, an openness. This is why I'm not a determinist. I need to do a talk on that someday. Sorry, waffling. Let's see, Mary Beth says, so if God is a signifier of something that cannot be defined or understood and unknowing, how does it operate in our lives for the good, our good, the good of others, and why worship the unknowing? Yes, that very, very good. The reason why it's important, I think, is that, and this is where I'm very close to René Girard in many ways, where René Girard says that the kind of like basically the central message of Christianity is the breakdown of the scapegoat mechanism. The scapegoat mechanism is where we put lack onto others. We put our own conflicts and our own struggles and darkness, right, onto the other because we cannot bear it within ourselves. And the whole thing about Christianity is Christ, you know, who's taking on our sins, right, all of the lack, is innocent. So what happens is the scapegoat mechanism only works whenever you actually believe that the other person is guilty. So an example I used at the live talk, and I forget her names, does any of you remember the woman who, she did a tweet years ago, she's getting onto a plane to South Africa, and she wrote, I hope I don't get AIDS, only joking, I'm white, right? You know, only joking, I won't, I'm white, something like that. And then she got on the plane, and then she flew 14 hours or whatever, and by the time she landed in South Africa, she'd lost her job. There were journalists there. Now, she had a tiny Twitter following. She was had some job and at some firm. But by the time she landed, she'd become viral, and she became this hated figure of ignorance and, all the worst things about America and all of this. And her life was destroyed for basically a joke, right? It was it's kind of joke you'd see in The Simpsons. Like, her joke was she's pretending to be dumb. Like, of course she knows she can get AIDS if she's white. So she's kind of being a self-deprecating, silly joke. But everybody just unified in this hatred of this one woman who then say was utterly destroyed. And we all partook in it. Even I remember, I think I got caught up in it. And for a brief moment, everyone was unified on Twitter through the hatred of this person, which is how the scapegoat mechanism works. Whenever violence becomes too much, society, if it's not to destroy itself, has to find a scapegoat, blame the scapegoat for all the violence. Everyone is unified briefly in the hatred of this other who is killed symbolically or literally, right? Even in therapy, this happens where a couple might get together and they hate each other, but then the therapist says something stupid and they both unify and think that the therapist is an asshole. And actually sometimes therapists encourage that because briefly they become the scapegoat so that the couple can unify over their shared hatred of the idiot who's trying to be the counselor, right? So that's what the scapegoat mechanism does, but the scapegoat mechanism only works when it's not acknowledged, right? Which is what I've talked about earlier today, is like it works through its failure to be acknowledged. As soon as the scapegoat mechanism is seen, i.e., oh, I put my stuff onto her, right? That's me. My goodness, like that's, that person was innocent. Then it's shocking, but it's salvatory, right? You take back the lack, you become a better person. So there's an ethical dimension to it, not because you're trying to be nice, but literally because you're confronted with your own conflicts and difficulties, all of that. So this is what the community does for me, is whenever God And whenever you have a community that it revolves around the Eucharist, the shared loss of God, this lack, this embrace of the lack, it creates a community of people who I believe can break the scapegoat mechanism. And the breaking of the scapegoat mechanism leads to profoundly positive results. I'll say one more thing about that. I do want to bring my talk out that I did a couple of weeks ago in LA, so I cover this in more detail there. But René Girard brilliantly describes original sin basically as an original violence that is within desire. So what René Girard says is, he says, when we desire, and you've heard me talk about this, when you desire, you don't just desire things, you desire people's desire. So whenever you care about somebody, you desire their desire, and you start to desire what they desire. So you start to desire objects that the other desires. This can create rivalry, because you start to then desire the same thing. If you're to start to desire your friend's partner, right? So you start to desire that person because of your friend's desire, and now you both desire the same person. So rivalry start, or there's jealousies and envies that result from this, or you start to desire to be that person, so you become obsessive, or you desire to overthrow them, so they become a rival, right? Desire, by its very nature, has this dimension to it for Girard. And the only way society originally deals with this is through the scapegoat, when the violence that will always erupt through communal desires interlinking goes onto the scapegoat, whatever. That's the only way to solve that. But a community centered around the breakdown of the scapegoat mechanism can find freedom from that. So that's kind of like, in a nutshell, I think, what's important but we could talk more. I'll do a couple more. What do you think accounts for people being compelled by one of these categories over another? I think, do you mean like affirmation or negation, belief in God or not believe in God? Or if you mean that, the funny thing is, I think that's just contingent. Like, that's really contingent on, because they're both the same thing. Whenever there's an argument, for example, a relationship works or it doesn't work, they're both kind of the same, because they both are coming from the premise that not working is bad. That's contingent. You can either fix the relationship and get rid of the not working element, or you get a new relationship that does work. So they're both the same, they just contingently are a bit different. And the contingency there, for example, is you could be going out with somebody who is pretty good, or you could be going out with somebody who's pretty bad, right? So there's a contingency about that. But basically everybody thinks the same, which is like, you want to go out with someone who it's healthy and it's good. You don't want to go out with someone if it's unhealthy and bad. And then if you've got a friend who's advising you, they might say that person's really bad for you for X, Y, and Z reasons, and it doesn't work, right? And you go like, that's the impotence of education, right? The impotence of education is is advice. Why does advice not work? Well, it doesn't work because there's an element of us that wants the unhealthiness. So it's contingent, I think, as to whether you say believe or don't believe, or whether you kind of whether you're a advocate of capitalism or a critic of capitalism in the affirmation negation sense. I think it's related to where you live, your context, what's happened to you. The universal is the negation of negation. That's the truth. That's the one. That's the thing that's not contingent. Then in terms of relationships, just one thing on that is, then the answer is, don't try and find a relationship that works, right? That would be boring. But don't try to find one that's completely destructive. Like, in one way, it's like, all relationships don't work, but some don't work better than others, right? There's some not working is fun. Some not working brings out the best in you and the best in the other person, in terms of productive conflicts, productive differences of opinion, productive differences of desire, right? So it's not about trying to find a relationship that works, it's trying to find a relationship that doesn't work in a way that works. And part of that is acknowledging it, like actually acknowledging. So for example, somebody might always find themselves attracted to people who are difficult to be with, like who are like at a distance, or have a job that makes them not very available. And you go like, but you don't know it. You're always attracted to them, but you cannot really cognize it. And so, but then the answer is maybe, yeah, you find anyone else boring. So once you kind of cognize it, you might be able to find someone where they have a type of job that they're away a lot, and then they come back and they're away a lot and they come back, and you find kind of in a way, a healthy way to have this not working dimension, because that's how your desire operates. You would actually die if the person was available all the time. So like the fantasy you have is actually a nightmare. Don't know if I'm waffling, but let's see, this is fun. Mark says, is Hegel's spirit the God of contradiction that is the energy that drives us into the unknown? And Mark, in a nutshell, I'd say yes. That's the reading of Hegel that Todd McGowan and Zizek and myself and Boothby and others really go with. So yeah, so Hegel's God, I would say, is the reconciliation, is the negation of negation. And because it's eternal, it's everlasting, it's in everything, it's omnipotent, it's omnipresent, it's like, in a nutshell, I think this is Hegel's philosophy, and we have not got an institution of it yet. That's what paratheology is in a way, is the development, and we need to get back into this, all of us, me especially, to help create communities where we live this out. Because it's all very well talking about it, but being in a community where we, on a weekly basis, invite this into ourselves, but keep ourselves cognizant of this, I think is what is what's healthy and what the next Reformation is. Catherine, very good question. Is it, how do we distinguish between when we're unhealthily reveling in our pain and versus properly enjoying our pain? Yes, I mean, when it comes down to individuals, it becomes wonderfully singular, right? And the answer is different for everybody, and that's what the interesting thing about analysis is, you get into that stuff. But I think the surface theory is pretty solid, which is that we're always right. There's two things. Is that if you hear at late at night like something knock on your door or your window, and you freak out, and it causes you fear, that's not pathological, right? That's natural. It's late at night, you hear something, right? But if you're always hearing somebody at the door or thinking there's somebody in the kitchen or whatever, right, then that fear is something you're getting something out of, right? So this, there's those are two extremes, and then everything is pretty much in the middle somewhere. So if you end up you happen to go out with somebody who is very difficult in a particular way, right? That's just maybe that was a mistake. But if you find that this is a repetition, it's something that happens over and over, then there's a sense in which there's something in the suffering that you're enjoying. Now, not consciously enjoying, but there's something that's drawing you back, something that's evoking your desire, something that's connected. And the answer then, the simple answer is, over, say, analysis, as you come to understand what that is, as you come to know it, you find yourself free from it. So we all kind of, it's like the mother, say, who sacrifices everything for her children and also maybe the people around her, and she's always going above and beyond, always, baking really nice things for parties, always doing so much, but so much so that it causes her suffering. And then you go, yeah, but there's something in it you're enjoying, right? And let's find out what that is. And in the knowledge of it, that enjoyment can find a healthier expression. But I do get what you're saying, because I think you're thinking as well maybe of that whole thing of like the kind of the emo kind of idea of like you light a black candle and you listen to sad music and you revel in your suffering and you have jouissance, pleasure in your pain. And so yes, what happens there, because it sounds like the person is actually enjoying their suffering, they find a way to enjoy it. I would say, but that person still has a fantasy of some undivided utopia that they haven't got. Like, so much depression is based on a fantasy that you miss something. So you may just be accepting your sadness, even wallowing in it, precisely because you have a notion of a non-contradictory, perfect reality that you don't have. An alternative world, you could have been with that person, you could have been with different parents, different things could have happened. So you got this fantasy of the perfect other world that's keeping you reveling in the suffering. And in that example, what one has to do is realize that that alternative world, even if it would be slightly better, would still have its traumas and its difficulties. And then I think that lifts the person out of that wallowing. Okay, let's see a couple more. Kev says, can you harp some more on community? Knowing unknowing seems such an individual pursuit in our already atomized culture. We are not born individuals. We are born into community and become individuals. Absolutely, you're absolutely right, Kevin. This gets us into, maybe I'll save this for another day, but what you're bringing out there, which is so important, is my desire, and I mentioned it with René Girard, my desire is so caught up in the desire of those around me. It's through the other's desire that I learn what to desire, and I start to desire their desire, and they desire me. And so our desire is fundamentally interwoven communally with one another. And so we're not, as you said, atomized individuals first. We start already intertwined with others. We remain intertwined. We get a sense of self, and the sense of self is a very important thing. If you don't have a strong sense of self, it can cause all sorts of problems. But ultimately, that sense of self belies the fact, that we are interconnected with each other's desires. And so, but I'm going to save the question of community maybe for another time, because there's so much I could say about that. Because that's basically what I want to aim towards, is that what I try and do with Spark and Wake is go like, we need each other to kind of help move in this direction. We need each other. Doing this individually is basically almost impossible. Like, we need art, we need music, and we need other people. So I suppose I'm agreeing with you and going like, yes, let's delve more into that. Daisy says, too soon for first draft LA takeaways. Interesting. Define confirmed expectations. Oh, are you asking, what my LA takeaways are as I leave? Okay, I'll maybe finish with that. That's good. If I'm hearing you right. That's very good. I have loved living in LA. I have to say, I've got very mixed feelings right now. It hit me. I'm a pretty even keel kind of guy, and this has not hit me at all, this move at all. I've just been like, oh yeah, I'm going to do it, and da-da-da. And then I think it was just last night, and my apartment's mostly bare. I'm looking out at LA. I went to this amazing art walk. If you live in LA, there's a place called The Brewery where like loads of artists live and have galleries, and there was an open day and you could walk around, and I was like, oh my goodness, like this is incredible. And then I was like, oh, I'm leaving this place. This is amazing. I love the weather, and I always love the rain, but I actually, come to love the LA weather. I've known some wonderful people here. So it's going to be, I'm starting to feel that. I've been 15 years in America, so I'm starting to feel that kind of little bit of sadness, excitement about going home for a bit, and also, I'm gonna miss Los Angeles. Over COVID, it was so dead. I live in downtown LA. It was so dead. So for my few years of living in downtown LA, a lot of it was very, very quiet. But you can see it starting to come to life. So that's just all I'm saying is, I've got a little kind of the last night and today, I'm starting to go, oh, going to miss this place. All right, thank you so much. Appreciate you signing into this. I really appreciate people's support as well. Allows me to do this work and continue to do other things. As I get back to Belfast, as I say, I'm going to continue with all this stuff. I'm going to be interviewing Richard Boothby soon for Patreon. I'm going to hopefully do some live events, get Podrick in, people like that. And I've even got an idea of starting my own podcast. So anyway, thanks so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.